Well, I spoke earlier about Labor's mass immigration policy, and without it, we would be in a recession. This is a Ponzi scheme economy being propped up by migration. So, of course, it suits Labor politically. All the while, we have a housing crisis, roads are congested, and rents are sky high. Just last week, the International Monetary Fund warned we need a major policy package to deal with unaffordable housing. To discuss the housing crisis and what it means in 2025, I'm now joined by Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies, Dr. Peter Tulip. Peter, good to see you. Thank you very much
Hi,
for joining me
Danica.
this evening. Firstly, describe it to us. How would you describe where the housing market is in this country right now?
I think housing is one of our biggest social problems. And this isn't just my view. I think opinion polls place housing as one of the top concerns that voters and households have, and it's swinging votes. The problem has many dimensions. One of the worst is the social divisions, that it's pitting old versus young, the housing haves versus the housing have-nots, the rich versus the poor. And a lot of young people, a lot of renters, a lot of young home buyers are very angry at being blocked out of the opportunities that previous generations had to build a home and to afford housing near where they worked. So there's a lot of anger and bitterness there. It's causing a lot of flow-on problems. That our home ownership rate is falling substantially. And I think that home ownership is a bedrock of Australian society. So that's a big problem, not just for the people involved. Rental stress is rising. That's causing a lot of problems for low-income earners. And high housing costs are one of the biggest causes of homelessness, which I think is one of the ugliest features of modern Australian cities. So it's a problem in all sorts of different ways. But to be fair, a lot of people are actually doing well out of this housing market. If you bought housing several years ago before the pandemic, then your net wealth has increased very substantially. So it is slightly mixed, but on balance,
Yeah.
it's a big problem.
Well, and I think you raise a very interesting point because there is such a social divide. I know for my generation, we would love to be able to break into the housing market, something that was much more easier, say, for instance, for my parents' generation. And now this is an acute vote-driving issue. So what's the solution here? What sort of policy do both sides need to take to the next election to actually make meaningful change in this sector?
Right. So experts have pretty much agreed that the main reason housing is so expensive is because of limited supply. And in turn, that's because of zoning restrictions or planning, it's also called. That is, we have restrictions on what can be built, where, how much, what it can be used for. And in particular, most of our big cities are reserved for detached housing. So we don't allow enough apartments, enough townhouses, enough density. And that restriction on supply, like in any market, when you restrict supply, it jacks up the price. So that's the main solution. How do we do that? The main thing is we need to change the zoning regulations, and that's a responsibility of state governments. And we are seeing at least a lot of rhetoric, but also some policy moves from the New South Wales and Victorian governments. They're probably leading the country in terms of telling local councils that they need to allow more building. That's the big story going on with housing policy. There's also quite a bit happening at a federal level. Do you want me to talk a bit about that?
Well, sure. I mean, look, Labor has tried to implement a number of policies. My issue with this is that they promised that they would build a certain amount of houses and they're not even close to that target. So where are we heading with these policies?
Yeah, so I agree with you there. I mean, I try not to be partisan on this, but I mean, and to sound a little bit balanced, I think state Labor governments are actually leading the country, but at a federal level, the opposition has got more constructive policies to deal with this problem. The Albanese government has really focused on social housing, where they're spending a huge amount of money for very little return. So they have a bunch of gimmicky policies like the Housing Affordability Fund and Rent to Buy, Build to Rent, sorry, and Help to Buy, all of which some of them are boosting housing by 30,000, some by 40,000. It doesn't add up to much at all. We've got an 11 million housing stock in Australia, and the policies of the Albanese government and barely amounting to rounding error on that. In contrast, Peter Dutton wants to build 500,000 houses through housing-friendly infrastructure. And I think that is actually a very constructive, useful policy.
Well, look, as I said, Peter, this is an acute vote-driving issue because we've got migrants coming into this country. It's propping up this economy. But the problem is that we don't have houses. People are trying to get into the housing market and rents are skyrocketing. So there needs to be a plan from both sides to take us forward. Really good to speak with you, Dr. Peter Tulip. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.